I was born in Poland in 1935, so I was 4.5 when the war started. I was the only child of university-educated parents. My dad had a law degree. My mom got married and had a child before she could finish, so she didn't. But they both worked for a man who owned the National Lottery, Jewish man. And I smile because every time somebody says they're going to buy a lottery ticket, I always say that I already won. Because the man who owned it was a big part of my life. My mother worked for him as well as my father. And I had a nanny, and I hated having a nanny. And the nanny would take me to the park on nice days. By the way, I was born in Lvov, Poland, which is now the Ukraine, and all that stuff's happening there. I'm so glad. It was Poland at that time. Before that, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it keeps changing borders. So it's not a big deal that it's changing borders again. Just we're not used to it. So I had a nanny, and I didn't like the nanny because the nanny kept me down when I was, I wanted to explore. And the nanny took me to the park on nice days. Then she would walk me home, and on the way she would stop at the church and light her candles and do her thing. And she did not let me run around. She kept me in a stroller even when I was too big to be sitting in a stroller. That was a very good thing in retrospect, because I learned how to sit when I wanted to run. One day, she let me out of the stroller. I was already 4.5, and she was talking to another nanny, and I was not allowed to go on the grass, but I could be on the gravel in front. And I snuck away a little bit, which I wasn't supposed to do, and I saw a beautiful grass daisy. And I knew it was bad. I was on the grass. But I stepped over the wire, and I picked it, knowing I was doing bad. And just then I heard a tremendous boom. And I thought that God was really mad at me, and that was a message. And I was terrified, but then I was even more terrified when I saw that the other people heard the boom too, because it wasn't just meant for me alone. It was so important that everybody heard what I had done. And so I ran back to my nanny, and a man came by with a big white dog and said, "Go home, the war has started." And so I know who started the war, and now you know who started the war. I loved the war to begin with because there was no nanny. My parents kept me very close. Nobody went to work, it was wonderful, and all kinds of big adventures happened. My parents, my father, rented a car and driver to take us away towards the Romanian border. It was a very adventurous thing that a biplane came over and shot at us, and we jumped into the corn. It was September, so the corn was high. And he didn't hit anything, including the car. But, stuff like that happened. For a kid, it was, very exciting. then my parents, they ran out of petrol, and so they rented a horse and buggy and a driver, and I got to sit up front with a buggy, that driver, and I learned how the driver communicated with the horses that by whistling and so on. It was just something. And some of it had to do with bad adventures, because people were running, they didn't know what was happening, and there was shooting, and we slept in a classroom, and they put board or chalkboards in front of the windows so the bullets would, not come through. Finally, we get to the border, and my mother and Dad have a conversation. My dad's got his arms behind him. They're walking back and forth or back and forth. Up the hill a little bit is the border. You have to understand that no one, especially no Jew, could go to another country. The country's closed off, as I'm sure you know. Not only, did America not let people in and so on, but nobody would take you out of Poland and into their country. But my father had money, and he figured he'll bribe the guy, maybe we can get through to Romania. And at the bottom of the hill was the walk where we were standing, and my mother and father had a big discussion, and my mom said, they were very elegant people, they went dancing, and they, had coffees and whatever. And a nice apartment, not our own, but a nice, maybe it was our own, but it was an apartment, I don't know. And she said, honey, how can we just leave everything, our stuff? How can we, our Persian rug and the paintings and the silver we got for our wedding, how can we just leave everything, my clothes? How can we just leave everything? And my dad walked up and down thinking, and says, well, this, after all, this is the 20th century, and we are in the Western world, and Germany is an educated country. What will they do? Kill us all? Okay, here, we'll go back. Unfortunately. I know a girl who the same thing happened with, except they did go into Romania and wound up in South Africa and had a perfectly lovely life without a war. I wish my mom had been able to let go. Anyway, we went back, and at first the Russians came. And, it was funny, we saw the Russians going, and my father talked to them, and he says, whom are you fighting? And they didn't even know, but they were going west, the Russians. And they came to Lvov, which is, as you know, Ukraine now, and so that was close to Russia, and they kept going. A part of Poland, and they were there about a year. I don't know. Things were tough because they were taking people away to Siberia. And it was a terrible fate. Everybody was scared to go to Siberia because it was wild and cold and people were dying of, no food. So they didn't want to go in the worst way. But turns out that a lot of the people who were taken survived there. So in retrospect, it was, I know a great story about that. Having done this interview business for several years, I know such good stories that I could probably be, who was it, Scheherazade, or who was it, with 1,000?
1,001 Nights.
Right, I could do that. Anyway, So they came back, the Russians came, and they caught my dad to take him to the Russian army. They needed more men, they were getting ready for a war. But my father, who had been a great tennis player and skier, jumped a big tall wall and came back home. I won't tell you any more about Russians because they were half friends. They were okay. There were difficulties and there was hunger, but they were okay. Then the Germans came. And at first my life was still okay. My father had bought a huge sack of white flour. And the white flour, my mother had always had a cook, but the white flour, his friends were making fun of him. But then it turned out that there was very big hunger, and we were able to make macaroni out of the white flour. So I'm very good at making macaroni. And then you hang it, it dries, it's very edible, and so we didn't starve. But then things got tough, really tough. People kept disappearing. And my parents would say, the Schwartzes, the Rosenbergs, the Cohens. And they didn't say any more, but it meant they've disappeared. There was there were awkward things, like one day the first time I ever played with the janitor's children. Mother usually kept me home. I was by then 6.5 or so. And they let me out, and a German soldier took me by the hand to walk me up on the landing between 2 floors, and showed me a gun, put a gun down, and kneeled down, or whatever he did, and he started to abuse me sexually. Oh, and he gave me a tomato, and he said, bite on it. It was very sick, it was. And I was really scared that he would shoot me, but I was also angry at him, and I knew that the tomato was like the stepmother gave a Cinderella, I think, a tomato to an apple pie, right? And it was, it was poisonous. So I knew right away that he was a bad guy, and I decided to make a run for it. And I figured maybe he couldn't shoot as fast as I could run. So I ran, and I rang the doorbell. He didn't even try to shoot because it was so quick. I don't know why. But, awful things happen all along. But one day, there was a big knock on the door, or maybe it was a doorbell. My mother answered it, and this gorgeous, tall, handsome German officer was standing, very importantly in the front at the door, with 2 lieutenants, and he had all kinds of ribbons and shiny boots, and I could describe his outfit, I could draw and paint it for you. He said something to my mother, and she said, of course, and they came in, and they looked around everywhere. They looked in the kitchen, the living room, and they said, yes, we'll take it. Be out in a half hour. You can each take a small valise. And I said, Mommy, they can't do that. Of course they could. They left. We packed. I had to leave my dolls with the open and closed eyes, and my teddy bear and everything. And I know that we took an extra pair of shoes, because I lived in that extra pair of shoes from 6 till 10, and my toes really shriveled. Anyway, something warm and a little bag, and each one of us took a little something, and we walked out at sort of the end of, the end of my childhood, the end of my glory days. And I remember their shoulders. Their shoulders were, held straight. They looked ahead. They didn't say a word. And we walked into the ghetto, which was very, very stuffed. Why was it stuffed? There were 150,000 Jews in Lvov. There were about 150 Jews in the surrounding areas who were pushed into this Lvov ghetto. So that makes 300,000. And the area they gave us was very small, and we were very packed at the beginning. My father had to take his mother, brought his mother with us. And my uncle, who was a chemistry physics professor at a Jewish high school, and not married yet, and Mrs. Bienenstock. And I like to think about Mrs. Bienenstock because she was a delight for me. She was very stuffy and elegant. Her husband had been some kind of official, and he was dead already. And her sons, she had twin sons, and the sons were finished university with my father, and they were twins, and they had a lot of pull because of their father's importance before the war, and they had been invited to Portugal. I don't know why Portugal. They knew someone in Portugal who was somebody, and they were offered a visa. Visa was an amazing thing because you could actually leave and go to Portugal. And, it was unheard of. And they said, isn't it a pity that we can't go? And my dad said, why? Of course, he realized it's because the mother was now alone, and they were in these terrible days they couldn't leave. This was just before the war started, I think. And so he had said, you go and I'll watch out for your mother. They were best friends. And well, Mrs. Bienenstock had to come in with us. We had a room and a half. And then we were all together, all smashed together, and that wasn't so bad. But it was very cold. There was no heat. There was a gas stove. And my grandmother, whom I didn't understand because I spoke Polish, she spoke German, Austrian, She was very quiet, and she taught me, supposedly, how to warm my hands at the fire. She said, come. And she put her hands like this and like this. It took me years to figure out what she was teaching me to do. There were no candles, there was no Shabbat, there was nothing. She taught me this. And so, of course, I do it. But it's amazing what a dummy I am. I mean, it never occurred to me what she was doing for many, many years. Anyway, I keep saying anyway, my dad came home one day. We were in this ghetto, but there were some non-Jews still living there because they could leave whenever they wanted. My dad came home and he had a bulge here under his coat, and he pulled out a huge bread. Well, bread, it was unheard of. We were starving, and this bread was amazing. And he cut the bread, and I see it before me, and he gave me the first piece. And I remember the taste. It had sand in it, It was kind of. I was so excited. We had this bread. But he said, an action is coming. An action is, as you know, how many of you have seen Schindler's List? Oh, wonderful. you haven't, please do. It's worth the time. And action is just like a roundup of cattle in Texas in the old cowboy movies, you know. It's just exactly. You herd them together and you get them to the train. So everybody rouse, you can rouse out of the house, you know. Well, Father was afraid, so he said, we have to find some place. So first, he had to take care of his mother and the old lady, Mrs. Bienenstock, the one that put on airs. And there were some other people in the apartment house. They wanted to hide their old people, and so they found an apartment with 2 rooms, like 2.5 rooms instead of 1.5 rooms. And they put the old people in there, and they put a cupboard in front of the door so that when the Germans came to look around, they would know that there's another bedroom in there, or that there's a bedroom there. And for us, he found a place. I only want to talk about a short time in the ghetto because so many bad things happen. And the story I'm about to tell you is just one story, 1 week in the ghetto. It doesn't mean that the other weeks were wonderful or not as scary, but I remember this 1 week and I forced myself to remember it. Somehow as a kid I wanted to remember this time. I could tell you that on the wall of this apartment house, on the outside, on the street side, there were 3 spots. And it was from the Germans taking toddlers and smashing them against the wall to see if they could smash the brain on the first try. There were 3 such spots, and people walked far, away from it. There were many, many horrors, but I want to tell you about this 1 week. So he came home and he said, he settled the old lady and grandma. Somewhere in there my uncle was taken, but they didn't talk about it. He disappeared, and they were kind of quiet, and nothing was said, to scare the kid. He was wonderful. He tried to teach me how to write and read, but unfortunately we had no paper, no pencil, no nothing, no newspaper, nothing. I didn't learn. So he said, in the middle of the night, he picked me up from bed and he took me to, if you imagine the courtyard being like much bigger than this room, and there were stairs, 3 stairs, going to that part of the building. And the stairs, were 2 or 3 steps. But if you went behind the stairs, there was a hole under there. It was dirt on the floor, just a hole. And we crawled under there, and I fell asleep again. And when I woke up, I looked around. And it looked like sardines in 2 rows. I don't remember if there were 8 people or 12 people or how many people there were. But there were people I didn't know, obviously Jewish. And we laid there, and my mother and father laid together, and I laid on the side of my mother. And I remember I always had an issue about that, because how come I wasn't between them? But they were whispering to each other. They couldn't talk because the non-Jews would hear us and give us away. It was very, very anti-Semitic. And non-Jews could get a lot of privileges or money or, sugar or whatever if they gave Jews away. So we had to be very quiet in that hole. We were there a week, maybe two, I don't know. At one point, a lady came, a woman, with a baby at her breast, which was terrifying because the baby could cry any time and give everybody away. Lucky for us, terrible thing to say, was the baby was too weak to drink the milk, and there was no milk because the woman hadn't eaten it for a long time. So I remember the baby doing, but nothing came out. The baby was too weak to cry. She had two toddlers. She laid down right next to me, and there were two toddlers at her feet, and they were all wrapped up, and I couldn't tell whether they were little boys or little girls or one of each. And there was a big boy, his name, I gave him a name in my mind, called him David. I don't know what his name was. David was maybe 12, and they had nothing to eat. We had, my father had a box with, not a full box, with sugar cubes. And he would pop a sugar cube in my mouth a few times a day, once, more than once. And the other people had nothing to do with food with us. We didn't really, I don't know if they communicated, I wasn't aware of it. But I kept seeing this woman, and she was this far away from me. And basically they had nothing. They had nothing to eat. What about drinking? Drinking was easy because every night at 3 a.m. we would all crawl out of that hole into the courtyard, and we stretched and we exercised. They were very anxious not to use their muscle power, in case of having to run or whatever. And I remember looking up at the sky and saying, God is too far away. He won't hear me. He won't see me. There was a spigot, and there had been bottles thrown into that hole. So there were a lot of water, there was water, and we washed out the bottles and got some water to take back with us. But there was a problem with peeing. So, when I had to pee, I had to get over that the people were lying right there and I needed to pee, and my mother said they'll turn their head. And they did, and I just had to pee into a bottle. Pooping was not necessary because nobody ate anything. But the story is about this lady and David. David kept saying to his mother, whispering to his mother, if they hadn't taken Dad, he would have made me go and find some food. But he was gone, and she didn't want to let him go. She just kept him. And he kept saying, I have to go. Look at them, they're starving. And so they had this frequent, whispering thing going. And finally, it's Sophie's choice, Finally, she said, okay. And he kissed her. It was dark, and he scurried out. I went to sleep. What they used to do is they used to lift up the manhole, go down into the sewers, and go out into the fields outside of the city and glean, see if there was a potato left in the earth or an onion or a carrot. They would tie their pants and stick the carrot in the pants or whatever they could, and then they would try to go back and give their parents some food. But the Germans found out, and there's a famous picture. I mean, the Germans were very proud of what they were doing. So they just, one guy photographed it, a German guy. When the manhole started to move up, they were standing there with their guns like this, and they said, okay, shake your pants. Undo them, because they would tie them here, and shake your pants. And if one piece of something fell out, they got a bullet in the head. A bullet in the head was, in a way, a heroic thing, because usually you didn't need a bullet. Bullet's precious, how much. There wasn't enough, so they did terrible other things with kids. Sometimes. I mean, I can't enumerate. Anyway, this boy did not come back. And I was this close to the mother's eyes. And that's why I can't forget that week. Because I saw horror in her eyes. It was astonishing. It was just palpable. And everybody in that hole was just, kids use the expression creeped out. My mother was very shaken. Very shaken. She kept frantically whispering with my father. I didn't know what they were talking about. And late, maybe midnight, next night, the woman was there, still, of course. And we went out, and my mother took me up the stairs to where we lived, but next door. There was a Ukrainian couple, and I always feel badly when I say that Ukrainian couple did something good, because they were so horrible to the Jews, so anti-Semitic, and were great helpers to the Germans. But this couple, they knew each other as neighbors. My mother said, please, Mrs., I wish I remembered her name. She said, I have a ring. I'll give you this ring. If you promise me that you'll take my daughter with you, I know you're moving, I know you're going tomorrow morning, that you're moving, please take my daughter with you and hide her for 1 week. I just want to know that she's going to be all right for a week. And she left me there, and you know that at 7 I was not thrilled to be left with strangers and not knowing if I would ever see my mother again, but I behaved. I did what I was told, because I knew the circumstances were really dire. They took me in the morning. They had a 1-bedroom apartment, new one, new to them. And someone had moved out, and I was to go to the bedroom. I was to stay in the bedroom the whole time. There was nothing in the bedroom except a heap of newspapers. There was another pack rat there. And I laid on those newspapers, and I so wished to be able to read it. I saw red letters and black letters and stuff, and I could not make any of it out. Of course, no school, of course. And these people worked at the outdoor market, and they sold stationery supplies. Every morning they would leave for the day, and I was supposed to stay in there, but they didn't lock me in. And she said, don't walk around the apartment because people can see you, and then we'll be in trouble. And that was true. But she never said anything about crawling. So I finally crawled out of there, and I crawled, and I saw these drawers, and I opened the drawers, and I've already been a naughty girl, so I knew I wasn't allowed to touch anything. But I saw papers of all kinds, lined paper, and plain paper, and little square paper, and pencils, and pink erasers. Oh, it was, to me, it was a heaven. And then I closed it quickly, and I kept crawling, because the reason I crawled out is because I was hungry. So I went to the kitchen, and there was nothing in the kitchen except a big glass jar of pickles. And I'm down on the floor, and I say, maybe they won't miss a pickle. So, you know, I finagled a pickle, and I sat there on the floor, and the juice of the pickle dripped down my chin, and it was so good. And then I thought, maybe they won't miss another. So I did it again. I didn't take more than 2 at a time. And then I crawled back into the safety of this room with my newspapers covered. I could look out the window because it was a very big, tall street. And so I amused myself. Amuse is not the right word, but I kept myself going by listening to the clip-clop of horses. They still had new cars and horses. Horse and buggy. In the morning, they would leave. In the evening, they would come, and they would cook a soup at night. It was I forget the name of it, the white turnip. The turnip soup, but they would give me turnip soup. If you ever see turnip soup on the menu, don't order it. It was awful, but I ate it anyway. And exactly a week went by. The man came in the middle of the day, took me by the hand, and took me back to the courtyard, which was a terrible thing because the non-Jews were looking to see if the kid's going to show them where the Jews are hiding, and then, then they can inform on us. But I figured that out before. Somehow, I don't know. And I sort of meandered over to the steps and sat down, and you see my hands went like this. It always happens. I covered my hand and I said, Daddy, are you there? And Daddy said, oh, thank you, honey. Thank you for not giving us away. Go down to the cellar. Now, remember I told you that my mother was really freaked out, and she gave the lady a ring to hide me, and she had a week of not worrying about me. So she went to another non-Jew, a guy, a tall, blonde, Aryan-looking guy, and she knocked on his door and said, She said, look, I have this ring with a red stone. Will you hide me for a week? Will you hide me for a week? And he said, oh, yeah, sure. We can go to the Aryan section and I'll put you in my office. So in the morning they walked out, and they walked out arm in arm, sort of like two lovers. My mom was a pretty young woman of 30 or 32. And the guards knew him, you know, also by his looks. Jewish man could not escape, because Jewish or not Jewish, they'd drag a man into the doorway and say, let's see. And if you were circumcised, you were dead. You know, there was nobody circumcised who was not a Jew in Europe at the time. So you didn't need papers. You could swear on your life. It wouldn't help. Anyway, they walked out, and he took her to his office, which was just a room without bathroom, without water, without anything. He said, I'll bring you some food later today. Well, he never did. And a day and a half went by, and she was thirsty. I get thirsty. Excuse me. She got very thirsty and very hungry, and she knew she was going to die because he wasn't coming around. And there was a branch of a tree that came to the second floor, was on the second floor, and she said, the only thing I can do is try to lurch out at the tree branch and then shimmy down and, you know, stay alive that way. And she did. And it worked. She grabbed onto it and she came down. And now she was in the Aryan section without papers, not knowing what to do. She was starving. She remembered the evil man, who was obviously not evil. But she found her name on one of the buildings after a while, and she went there and she knocked on the door and she said, Maria, please, please hide me. And Maria said, I can't take you into my rooms because my husband will give you away immediately. But wait till he falls asleep. He falls asleep early, and I'll take you someplace. And so she did. My mother said, she said, go to the top step, and I'll take care of you. After a few hours, she came, and she said, come to the cellar. Everybody had a room to stash their junk in. You know, they're like we use our garages, I guess. But it was, you know, had a lock, and it was dark, and she had a folding bed. And so she opened the folding bed, and she gave her a blanket. She brought down some hot potatoes, and my mother was like, in heaven, you know, just rested and just slept without having to worry and be scared and be whatever. And so for several days she had this time out of time. And suddenly one night she heard footsteps. Janitor, said the Germans, come open the doors here. We have to check even in the Aryan section to make sure Jews aren't hiding. And janitor came with his keys, and he started opening one door after the next. My mother heard them cock their guns. She said the Shema. She knew it was over. She was just waiting in terror. And when they came to her room, there was no key. So where's the key, janitor? Well, the lady upstairs must have it. Well, go get it fast. And they're standing there, cocking their guns, and she sees the dark under the light under the door. And they're standing there, and a dog comes and jumps up and runs away, and plays with them and runs away, and plays with them and runs away. And they say, come on, let's see where the dog wants us to go. And they walk away, and the janitor says, I have to keep it. It's all right. And they walk. After a couple of hours, Maria comes down and says, I could have been killed. And Mother said, I'm so grateful. Thank you. And she ran out. She left. And she walked into the ghetto. The ghetto is easy to walk into. It's just impossible to walk out of. Very true. And it was on the same morning that she came back to the courtyard and somehow had let my father know, delicately, furtively, that she was going to the cellar. And then I came, and my father said, go to the cellar. And there was my beloved mother, whom I hardly didn't think I would ever see. After you see why that incident is seared into my brain, my mother was still very disturbed. The action was over. We got back into our apartment, and any minute, it was, again, any minute. And my mother expressed herself to him, and he went out, and he bumped into a man, Mr. Cole, who was in their friendship group before the war. Also a Jewish man who, I don't know if he didn't work in the same place. He had a comb factory, combs and buttons made out of horns. I remember the silliest things. And I happen to know with a certainty of a 5-year-old child or a 7-year-old child that he had a crush on my mother. I just know it. I didn't see them kissing or anything, but I just knew that there was some tension between the two of them. And the man said, I think I know where I can get Aryan papers. And he did. It cost some money, and my dad gave it to him. He paid for it, and he got, I remember the paper. It was a very simple paper with blanks, and there in the blanks we had to fill in our names. I'm not telling you the story of the Holocaust. I'm telling you a story of how it was around me, because I was just a kid. We sat there in the ghetto, and now there were fewer and fewer people. We sat there in the ghetto trying to decide. Our name was Shapira. You couldn't get more Jewish than that, so we had to fill out the blanks with a very Polish name. So this was my father's reasoning. Every farmer in Poland knew one thing about the Jews, that we were kosher and we didn't eat pig. So he figured that if he would find a last name with the word pig in it, everybody would know that we couldn't possibly be Jewish. So we sat there, and they kept figuring out names, and they came up with something that vaguely sounds like Baconovsky. And we filled it in. And I was now Baconoff's. Now the question was, how were we going to get out of... Now we had our papers. He couldn't go because he was circumcised. And he looked like a Jewish man. He certainly wasn't tall, blonde, and Aryan looking. So how are we going to get out of the ghetto? And there was a whole big... it was a very furtive plan. It involved that Ukrainian guy and money and all kinds of strange movements and taking off the Jewish armband with the Star of David on it. And somehow I would dearly like to remember the details, but I don't. Somehow we found ourselves the next day at the gate of the ghetto, and my father came, and he was supposed to be somebody we didn't know, or we just knew very little, because I now was not a Jew. There was a guard. He had his armband on, and he was on the border, and my mother said, "Don't hug him. Don't kiss him. Say goodbye like you hardly know him." And I was smart enough to know that I might never see him again. And I wanted to hug my daddy, who was my everything. But I didn't. And I held my arms and my shoulders very tense, like she ordered me. And my dad brought a little sieve, because it's all he had for a little goodbye gift. Because I used to hate in the old days, to drink milk with skin on top of it. You had to boil the milk, and I objected to it as a kid. And he brought bread with a little bit of something smeared on it. And I was amazed that he could do this amazing, the sandwich of 2 pieces of bread for our journey. It was wonderful. But what remained with me always is this tightness of having to. And I politely said goodbye, and I wanted to scream. He had found a man from a tiny little village. He paid him. And he said, "Take my wife and daughter with you to your village and tell them that she's your cousin's wife and daughter, and you don't know what the hell happened to your cousin, brother, and you kind of want to look out for them because they're by themselves." And that's what happened. We met the guy at the station. How we got there, and we got on a non-Jewish train. And the train was packed, and then it wasn't packed anymore, but it was packed all night, and it was hard, to stand. And I was very tired. In the morning, there was a seat, so I sat down, and up came a guard, pinched my cheek, said, "What a cute little Jewish girl you are." I am not a Jewish girl. My mother had trained me, believe me. I am not a Jewish girl. And so he said, "Well, then show me how you pray." And I said, "I only pray to Jesus and Mary, and I could cross myself for you." And so I did. I knew how. And then he said, yes, but your daddy's a Jewish man, right? And I said, Mommy, this man is calling Daddy bad names. And my mother said, "Come away from the child. Come with me." And they disappeared for a half hour, maybe less. And when they came back, he was smiling, and he left me alone. The other guy, the farmer who was taking us, was in another car, a railroad car. And we wondered whether he gave us away or how this guard, managed to find us, because he was the one holding our valise. We had a valise. Everything we had was in that valise, just one. Either he wanted what was in the valise and he didn't want the trouble, or maybe it was an accident that he picked on me. I don't know, but my mother resolved. And then, we came to this village, and I totally forgot to look at the time. Is it okay still?
You're good.
Good.
About half an hour?
Terrific, yes. I can do this in 70 years and a half. So we were in this tiny town. Nobody knew that we were Jews. He found us a place to live in it was a livestock barn, and there were divisions, and we got one of the divisions, and we slept on hay, but we were Polish women, just poor, and it was war. So that's why we lived that way on the farm, and there was nothing to eat. The only thing we had was my mother had a bag between her breasts of money, and this money, rolled up money, was to pay off anybody who caught us. Maybe if we gave them the money, they would let us go. That was the purpose of the money. And a tiny little bottle with Bellergol, which is supposed to calm you, and I don't know, if you take enough, you can kill you, whatever. That she didn't talk about killing, but she had that. And so we were hungry. We were starving. Yes, we were on a farm, but we couldn't say, "Hey, farmer, let's give us potato." So she went to the baker and she said, "You have a beautiful wife. She's a young, beautiful woman, and I have these silk dresses from the city, and I have a platinum watch and a diamond ring for my engagement. I'm happy to give you everything as long as you promise me a piece of bread every day for my daughter and me." And he said, "Okay." And so my mother gave him everything, and he could not give it to us. But my mother made me play with his little girls and, honor. And she played the great lady from the city. She didn't go to church, but her daughter had to go to church and that kind of stuff. And she was very fancy. She pretended to be from, big city. And she honored them with her presence. And they were very flattered because, after all, he was a baker in a tiny village and it was this lovely lady. And so I played with their two daughters, and I remember the terror of waiting to see if he would give us that piece of bread every day, because that's all we ate. And I remember I would look up at him and I would see he had a very large forehead, and I was terrified of that forehead because he held, our lives in his hands. Two stories very, very quickly. There was an action there. We left in June someplace, early June someplace, that's all I know, of 1942. We left the ghetto after 1 year being in the ghetto. We got there, and the ghetto was totally decimated in less than 2 weeks after we left. Meaning, it was open, there was no one left. They had herded people to camp, they had killed them off, there were, they took them they cleaned out the ghetto. So less than 2 weeks, we would have been among them. My father was caught and taken to a concentration camp. It was a weird concentration camp because some of them were taken into the city under guard to clean out the Jewish households and send all the stuff to Germany. So they would have to carry furniture and load it and carry stuff and load it and send it to Germany. There were a lot of good things. And he would come back, they would come back afterward. I read in a book that was written by a rabbi that who found himself there, that after they came from work, they wanted to see if these people were strong enough to work another day, then they would get something to eat. Otherwise, no. So they had them running from one side of whatever to the other side, back and forth, back and forth. And I don't know if there was a specified amount of time, that must have been. And anybody who fell down was dead. They would not get anything to eat, was killed. And anyone who did this running, even after working all day, would get food. And apparently, my uncle was mentioned, the Shapira, the school teacher, was one of the people who fell down. That was my uncle. My father, well, we lived far away. And my father was able to smuggle a couple of letters through that Ukrainian guy because, people came and they had money on them, maybe sewn in or something, then they would die and they would, you could just take the money and, I guess, and pay off the Ukrainian guy to mail a letter. It's funny that you could mail a letter. It always astonished me that my father was able to get a letter out to us. It was on crappy paper and pencil, but still. One of the letters, so here we are in this little village, and after a while comes a letter, and then another, and it says basically, I saw Sid. He said, I saw Sid. Sid is, he didn't say, here I am at camp. Obviously it was a letter of a non-Jew to a non-Jew. He said, I saw Sid. Sid is planning a vacation. What did it mean? He's going to run away, right? Well, I don't know if he tried to run or not, but the letter stopped. We never found it. Two little stories. So there was this action in this little village, because half the village was Jewish, half was non-Jewish. And the Jews did the handling, the give me your eggs, I'll sell them in the city, that kind of middleman kind of thing, whatever. Sewing, whatever. And so there was an action, and they took a huge percentage of them away. And they put them in, you know where they put them? They put them in a synagogue. The synagogues were usually made of wood. So they would lock the doors, light the synagogue up, and get rid of a whole bunch of Jews really fast. It was easy. But this synagogue was made of stones. And they kept them there, and the kids on the farm, said, the Jews are, cracking the windows and sticking money out. so we'll get them some water. And of course we take the money and we don't go back and bring them water. And I said to my mother, I'm going to go bring them water. And she said, no, you're not. It'll be the death of you. They'll figure you out. And it's very, very obvious. The other kids are laughing and making fun of the stupid Jews that I'm bringing them water. How is that? So I remember being very angry at my mother. Anyway, I understand it now. So they were taken to Majdanek, which was like 25 kilometers away, and other work camps. The farmer had a bunch of kids, ranging from married to little ones. And one day I was in there. It was the whole house. I thought of it as big, but I went back and the house looked like a small garage. It's amazing what, you think of as a kid. They were sitting at a big farm table one night when it was cold and blustery. And then there was a knock on the door, and then Mr. Gottner opened the door, and there was a man with a young teenage son in his arms, and he said, I am something like Goldman. You know me, we used to live up the hill, and we used to trade, remember, goods, and now, look, my son and I have been hiding in the forest for several months and we're doing fine. But look, his foot has gangrene. And now I have to cut off his foot. If you don't have penicillin, it just goes right through. He says, I can't do it. I can't cut off my son's foot. Please, Mr. Gottner, will you get me the doctor? And Mr. Gottner got up, yes, sit down, and he put on his heavy coat, went out into the blustery night, and came back with 2 Germans. He took away the man and his child, his teenager. And the next day I found out that they killed them, and the farmer got 2 kilos of sugar per head. That was a very frequent price for a Jew. That's one story. The other story is that there was a dentist. There was, right next door, there was a 2-story house. It was like under the roof, kind of a room with an open window. It was before the man with a boy with a foot, because it was still summer, the window was open, and there was another action, and that meant everybody out. Jude raus, Jews out. And a German came in and he said, you must go out. And the woman was on the bed and she said, you see, I have broken my leg. And it's not set yet. And I'm the only dentist in this town, and maybe you guys you men or you gentlemen at the headquarters might need me. Yes, he said. That's a good idea. I will go and ask for special permission to leave you. But I have to take you out. Those are my orders. And he very gently took her by the mattress and took her down the stairs onto the street. Out. Mr. Mustache, the kids called him. He was a man with a mustache, a very harsh soldier. And he came by and he said, get up, and she went into her story again about having a broken foot, and the other man went to the headquarters. And he said, get up. And she wouldn't get up. She couldn't get it. He took out his revolver and he shot her here and here and here. He liked to see them squirm before they died. And she finally, the kids were standing all around. She finally died. Skip 48 years. I'll go back. Skip 48 years. I arrive in this village in 1989 with my husband, my 20-year-old son, in a very long limousine with a driver. It's scary to go there. You have to, have a little power behind you. So, it was Sunday morning. I told everyone to wait in the car. I went into the church. And I had a crisis of a kind. There I had gone to church every day in May and every Sunday the rest of the time. And here was the, splattering of the water and the whole thing. And so I belonged here, but I belong somewhere else now, and who am I really? The kind of... And then I looked at the wall, and the wall had paintings, little circles and paintings inside. And what was it but Jerusalem with 8 steps of the cross, or whatever they call it? 14. What? 14? Who counts? Okay. Sorry. And I looked at Jerusalem, and I looked at the church, and I looked at Jerusalem, and I said, that is my Jerusalem. This is where I belong. And people were just filing out, and they looked at me strangely. And I found one of the girls, the baker's girls. She recognized me immediately. She says, where have you been? And invited me to her house. And then I said, are your mother or father alive? Yes, they were still alive, believe it or not. And she took me to them, and yes, they remembered me. And do they remember my mother? Yes. And my strong American Jewish doctor husband said, ask her if she has anything left of your mother's. My mother had been dead a long time. And my father. And, I didn't dare, but then I dared. And I asked, do you have anything of my mother left? All those dresses and so on. And she says, no. The partisans stole the watch. No, but my daughter still has the ring. And then, I went on a big hunt to find the daughter, and the daughter was in another town, and the telephone for that. I had to come back and write her, and finally she agreed to sell me the ring. And somebody was going to Poland, and anyway, I got the ring, and I'm not wearing it today. I wore it for several years, but it got very thin, and I'm afraid it'll crack and fall off, so I don't have my ring with me. I'd like to show it to you because I wore it as a symbol of my mother's and father's love, whom I wanted so much to, be alive. So we survived the war in many strange and terrible stories, and time in the forest and sleeping in the forest and finding a big bunker of the Jews who hid in the forest, and they built themselves a beautiful bunker, very precise. They had already been found and taken away. And then the Russians came, and we were starving, and the Russians gave us some magic food, and we didn't die after all, and we went back to the city. We found nobody alive. And they used to take charcoal and get on somebody's shoulder, and up high they would write, like Dana Schwartz, on the house where they lived. They wrote their names so that if anybody else from the family would come, there was no way to know except to see the name. It was very, it's really interesting. And my mother and I went to the camp where my father had been when he had written us, and said college. And then we left on the back of a truck. I can't tell you how we were homeless and we had 2 raw eggs between us, and that's all we had. There were very bad times, and just one piece of luck after another. We jumped on the back of a truck going west to Poland because it was being annexed. Yeah. And we went to Poland, and there were some agencies in Poland who helped us. For example, my mother somebody helped us rent a room. And very little money. And one day we got something like $100 today. A lot of money, my mother said. I was very skinny. I was not used to eating. I was a depressed little kid who didn't say very much. My mother tried to, awaken me, and she said, "Look, sweetheart, we have so much money. What shall we do with it?" And I managed to say, Mother, remember before the war when we used to have dinners and there would be soup and then another plate with meat and potatoes and went on with, and then there was dessert, and then my father would say, "Those were good hors d'oeuvres, now where is the meal?" And I would laugh. That's what I want. I want a dinner like that. And she said, "Damusha, you still remember that? You remember dinners?" Then she took me by the hand. She took me to the window, and she showed me kids playing. Now, Poland annexed a piece of Germany that had been Germany, and the inhabitants all spoke German. So the kids downstairs that were playing on the street were really German kids. And my mother said, look at those boys and girls. They're starving, and you want such a fancy dinner. She really shamed me. And I said, "I don't care about them. I hate them. They killed my dad. Their dad killed my dad. And I don't want to give them food." And she was very sad. And the next day she borrowed a big pot, and she went to the outdoor market and she bought barley and vegetables and bones, and she made a big soup. She took me by the hand downstairs where the kids were playing, and she said, "If anybody here is hungry, come upstairs to floor so-and-so and bring a bowl and spoon with you." And they all came because they were all hungry because they had lost the war and now they were hungry. And my mother ladled the soup for all of them. And I always thought, what was she teaching me? How was she different? We managed to escape, to get out of Poland. Most of the Jews that were left went to Germany because the Americans were there and the Americans were taking care of them. and providing them with food and so on. But I was too terrified to go to Germany. I would see a German man walking at me and I would still be terrified, war or no war. So I begged my mother to take me to Sweden instead. Sweden also took some people in, survivors in. And one day, a very famous thing was happening. There was a big meeting, maybe, I guess 100, 125 people, I don't know why that's in my head. And they were all sitting, they were all survivors, and on the stage there was one man and one radio, and the radio was saying something. I was 12 now. And I was looking at all those people and their shoulders were so broken, They'd all lost their families. They were all skimpy and skinny and sad and missing their people. And they sat there and they listened to the man on the stage. And the guy on the stage was yelling out names of countries. It was the United Nations voting whether the Jews could have their land back or not. And suddenly, at the end of the count, it was, I think, United States and Uruguay. Yes. And everybody jumped up. And I remember their shoulders suddenly going like this. And they sang Hatikva. And just tears were just dripping down their faces. And I felt like, I was in a room that was something amazing was there. I was just a kid. I didn't know, but I felt it. And I've never forgotten the shoulders suddenly straightened up. And then there was a question of going to Israel or going to America. And Israel was fighting other wars, and I was terrified of wars. And my mother had met somebody who knew the address of the man who owned the lottery before the war, her boss. And she wrote to him, and he sent us an affidavit, meaning, I promise that they will not be wards of the state. I will take care of their needs. And then it took 5 years. My mother, when we were just right after the war, just when we were looking for everybody and everybody was gone, she said to me one day, I promise, she said it because I had just saved her from a rape. There was a Russian soldier was trying to rape her and he was drunk, and I jumped on him and I kicked him and scratched his eyes while my mother ran away, and big drama. I was very good at reacting. I don't know. I was lucky that I did it. Anyway, she said to me, just wait. I am going to take you to a country where you can have a Jewish last name, where you can be friends with anybody, you can study whatever you want to study, you'll be respected, and you can say that the president has rags in his head and they won't throw you in prison. I said, come on, Mother, I'm 10 years old, I've been through the war. Don't tell me there's a place like that. She said, there is, and where I'm going to take you, it doesn't even snow. I had those shoes that I told you about for 5 years or more, 6. And, I wore newspapers around my feet from the snow. It was very, very cold. And she's telling me these stories. And I said, it's impossible. There is no such place. And she said, you'll see. Took her 5 years. She brought me here, and shortly after she died, and then I was a real orphan. And the man from the lottery was helpful, and I finally went to school a little bit, and then I went to college where I really liked it. And I decided I'd never been in elementary school, so now I can become a school teacher, and I'll be in an elementary school. And I loved being a teacher in elementary school. And then I married and had 3 big, beautiful boys. They weren't big to begin with. And I became a therapist. And the best part, I think, of my career was that I worked very hard at the Shoah Foundation. I always wanted to know, where did all those people go? Where did the Jews go? Am I the last Jew? What happened to all the Jews? And when I was working for the Shoah Foundation and interviewing people, I found out. And it was very important to me on many levels. And so I'm very proud to say that I work for the Shoah Foundation. And I could go on, but I'm done. Please ask me questions.
Dana, how come you don't have an accent?
I'll tell you. I had to learn Polish. I had to learn Russian. I had to learn German. I didn't have to, but it was around me. I had to learn Swedish. And I got here when I was not quite 15. And apparently, is a spot in your brain that sort of closes off when you're a teenager, around 14, 15. And I just made it, you know.
Wow.
And I was pretty good at the sing-song of languages. I'm very bad musically, but somehow the sing-song of languages, yeah, I can speak to you in Swedish, and you know that I'm Swedish. And you know, that kind of thing. So it's the rhythm, whatever I
You got
it. Yeah.
Wow.
Please.
What would you speak to your mom on the train and stuff when you were fleeing if you couldn't speak Hebrew?
What saved my life is that I did not speak Yiddish. Because Yiddish is a guttural language like German. And the Poles all knew if you spoke Polish with a Yiddish accent. I spoke only Polish, and a perfect Polish, because my nannies and so on. It was my language. I spoke Polish. And so, does that answer your question? Come on, you must have some curiosity about something.
Did the upper classes, the upper classes in Poland speak Yiddish, or did they mostly speak Polish?
You're right. They mostly spoke Polish. Actually, Yiddish was low class.
Right. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, it was low class, and my parents were upwardly mobile. My grandfather on my dad's side owned the Jewish bank. My grandfather on the other side made saddles. And I know that both of them spoke Yiddish. But, you know, the 30s and Vienna and the musicals of America and all that, they were at another level. The big city. It's not that they were so rich, it was that they were
Of a class.
of a class. Yeah. Had I spoken Yiddish or Polish with a Yiddish accent, instead of a Pole out here, I would not have made it for a minute. There are many stories I didn't tell you of how much the Polish kids hated the Jewish kids, and hated the Jews, and how that was so virulent, and that Germans, you had, that, you know, that mustache I told you about, Mr. Mustache. I told you I went back to Poland in '89, whatever it was, and I stood there with one of the baker's daughters, and the other women from the farm where I had lived in stood there at the crossroads, and I was there and so I said to my son Johnny, you see, this is the place, or that is the place that Mr. Mustache killed the dentist. And the two words that are same in Polish and in English are dentist and mustache. So they knew what I was saying, and they were saying, to them. And it isn't so much that he realized it, it's that I was able to corroborate my story. That there was a witness. It's an amazing thing that happens. Suddenly, you feel that the other must believe you now. It's not just a story, it's the truth.
Did they know you were Jewish?
Oh, no. When we came back, you mean?
No. When you were staying with them, they didn't know you were Jewish.
Nobody knew. Had they known,
Okay.
the same fate that happened to the other, the guy with the foot kid would have happened to me immediately.
But did you, when you came back, did you let them know
Yes.
you were Jewish?
Yes.
And how did they react?
I thought they were going to, people thought, don't go, they're going to kill you, because they kept killing Jews. But they really, it was later, and there were no Jews around, so they got, it wasn't, I don't know, I just, as I said, I drove in a fancy limousine, and I was, I tried very hard to be a somebody there so that they wouldn't, drag me off to the side and kill me. And also, they could only get a present from me if I lived. They could only benefit by being nice to me, which they did. As a matter of fact, the old man who was the baker was very, very sick. He had a bad heart. And my husband was a heart specialist. So he, without having anything to listen to his heart, he put his ear to the guy's chest, and he looked at the medications, and he changed all the medications. And the guy got much better. And the second time I was there, the old lady was kind of mad because she thought he was already going to die and leave her alone. And now he's walking around, But yes, they got it. They got it. But nobody knew it then. It was terror to think that somebody would know, because it would have been like blackmail. It would have been like the worst,
Well, they would have gotten some more sugar.
Or exactly, they would have gotten more sugar. So what I'm telling you is not about the Holocaust. I don't teach you about the Holocaust. I just wanted you to walk through with me as a little kid and see. I didn't even tell you of all the people that fell away. A million children, over 1 million children who didn't do anything to anybody. And finally, I want to say that I had a little friend up till when I was 6.5. I had a friend named Lily who always did everything better than I. She was about a year older. And she had curly hair and I had straight hair. And she had big, beautiful eyes. I think they were blue. And I had brown eyes. And she was going to ballet, and I didn't go to, I only went one time before the war started. And she was learning French, and she was playing the piano, and she was doing, and my mother would say occasionally, look how well Lily's doing, why don't you do that too? In spite of that, I loved her deeply. And this is how she died. She was no longer with her mother, she was with her father. Her mother had been taken somewhere else. This is a story that a neighbor told us after the war, our mutual neighbor. Lily was clinging to her father's legs as he was shot and fell backward into a mass grave. And Lily, who was not shot, just did not let go of the legs, fell in with him and was buried alive. And the neighbor was shot very lightly and pretended to be deathly wounded and fell in. I mean, they didn't care. Like, you fall in, that means, you're going to be buried. And he fell in on top. And there was oxygen because people fell unevenly, and so there was still a little bit of oxygen there, and he dug his way out.
With her?
Without her.
Without her?
She died. But he made it out. And it was huge. It wasn't exactly next door.
It's like Bobby Yar.
Yes. But there were many Bobby Yars. There were many mass graves everywhere you looked.